She checked into a seemingly perfect apartment. But on day 3, she found a hidden camera. That was terrifying, but the footage she discovered on that SD card? It proved she wasn't the victim. She was just the next name on a terrifying list. You will not believe what the previous tenants were desperately trying to tell her. Watch until the end to see how she escapes the impossible trap. Alara ran a hand over the antique wooden dresser. The polished surface felt cool and slightly greasy under her palm. She had only been in the apartment for 3 days. A subtle, persistent sense of unease clung to her like damp air. It was not true terror, but a deeply irritating feeling of being observed. The late afternoon light slanted through the window, making dust motes dance. She traced a finger along the seam where the wall met the ceiling. That corner felt wrong to her. Her breath hitched in her throat. There was a faint, almost invisible pinprick hole. It was cleverly masked behind a peeling scrap of floral wallpaper. She pressed her thumb against the spot where the wall should be solid. The thin paper gave way, revealing a tiny, dark gleam. It was a lens. A hidden camera. Alara yanked her hand back quickly, as if she had touched fire. The air in the room instantly grew thin and cold around her. Her heart hammered against her ribs, loud and frantic in the silence. She carefully peeled back the rest of the torn paper. The device was smaller than a postage stamp, expertly wired into the molding. This was not a cheap consumer toy. This was professional equipment. The initial surge of panic drained away, replaced by an icy, focused determination. She had to discover who did this, and why they chose her room. She located a miniature SD card slot and carefully managed to eject the chip. Her hands were shaking slightly as she walked to her desk. She inserted the small memory card into the side of her personal laptop. The laptop screen blinked once, and then showed a list of file folders. She clicked on the folder labeled Current. It opened to show a single video file. Alara clicked play, her whole body tensing up. The video feed showed the very room she was sitting in at that moment. But the date and time stamp in the corner was wildly wrong. The video was recorded 5 years ago. And the girl sitting at the desk with her back to the camera was not Alara. She was a complete stranger. Alara watched the stranger for a brief, tense moment. The girl slowly lifted her head. She turned, looking directly into the hidden camera lens. The stranger's lips parted in a desperate, silent motion. She mouthed a single, heartbreaking word clearly. It was the word, help. Then the video file abruptly ended. Alara sat frozen, staring at the blank screen. She scrolled through the other folders, feeling a dread like cold stone. Every single video was dated before Alara had ever moved into the building. They were all different people, living in this exact room, over the past decade. Every single occupant eventually looked up at the camera. And every single one of them mouthed the same silent, desperate plea. Alara realized the camera was not broadcasting a live stream to someone else. It was merely recording these terrifying final moments. It was a digital time capsule of fear. The truth was that the camera was not hidden by a voyeur for the present tenant. It had been deliberately left as a message from the past residents. She was not the random target of a stalker who wanted to watch her. She was simply the newest, temporary resident of what felt like a pre-prepared cage. The most recent video file in the current folder was labeled plainly, My First Night. Alara looked around her new room, feeling the collective, terrified eyes of 10 years of strangers upon her. She looked at the door. She heard a soft, nearly silent click coming from the lock. The doorknob began to turn. Alara could not move. A shadow stretched long and dark under the door frame. The door slowly started to open. The hinge creaked, a thin, sharp sound that echoed in the silence. A man stepped into the room. He was tall and wore the simple gray overalls of the building superintendent. His face was completely expressionless. He held a small, black toolbox loosely in one hand. His eyes scanned the room briefly, then landed directly on Alara. His gaze was unnervingly calm. "Evening," he said, his voice flat and low. "Just came to check the ventilation in this unit. Been acting up." He took one slow step further into the room. Alara remained seated at the desk, the laptop screen still displaying the empty video player. She quickly, instinctively, slid the tiny SD card into her pocket. "The ventilation seems fine," Alara managed to say, her voice shaking slightly. She pointed toward the far wall. "I haven't had any issues with airflow." The superintendent did not look at the ventilation grate. His eyes remained fixed on Alara's face. He took another step, closing the distance between them. "Ah, well, that is what they all say at first," he replied with a faint, chilling smile. He placed the toolbox on the floor with a quiet, deliberate thud. Maintenance is always preventative, you see. His gaze drifted briefly to the corner where the hidden camera had been. He did not need to check the camera itself. He was checking Alara's reaction to the corner. Alara swallowed hard, trying to keep her expression perfectly neutral. She knew she had failed. The man straightened up slowly, his attention returning to her eyes. "You seem comfortable here, Alara," he stated, using her name without having been told it. "It is a lovely room, is it not? Very private." His hand, large and rough, reached out toward the desk. It moved not toward the laptop, but toward the very edge of the desk closest to her. He was deliberately moving between Alara and the door. He did not need to ask about the camera. His presence was the answer. The truth was not just the hidden device, but the keeper of the camera. Alara realized the desperate messages from the past were warnings not about an unknown watcher, but about this man. She saw the faint, familiar outline of something metallic tucked into his back pocket. It looked like a set of heavy, antique keys. The keys that controlled all the doors in the building. Alara pushed her chair back violently, scraping it against the wooden floor. She jumped up, spinning away from the desk and toward the window. The man's calm exterior broke immediately. He lunged forward with surprising speed. "Do not be foolish," he commanded, his voice now harsh and demanding. "It is just easier this way." He was close now, his heavy steps closing the distance rapidly. Alara did not look back. She reached the window and frantically fumbled with the heavy brass latch. It was stiff and cold under her desperate fingers. She forced it open. A blast of cool night air hit her face, a brief, sharp taste of freedom. She heard the man's breath directly behind her. His hand shot out to grab her shoulder. Alara slipped her elbow free and dropped her shoulder, ducking low. She scrambled through the jagged opening in the glass and wood. She tumbled headfirst into the cold, damp flower bed below. A searing pain shot through her side, but she barely noticed it. She rolled immediately, pushing herself up onto hands and knees. She looked back up at the broken, jagged window. The superintendent's head and shoulders were silhouetted against the dim light of the room. His face was contorted into a mask of pure, frustrated fury. He began to shout her name. Alara did not wait to hear the rest. She sprang to her feet and ran blindly into the deep shadows of the apartment building's back alley. She did not feel the throbbing pain in her ribs right away. The cold, greasy air of the alley hit her face. It smelled of rot and metal and yesterday's rain. Gravel scraped and shifted under her bare feet. She heard the sound of the front door to the service hall violently slamming open. Heavy footsteps immediately pounded onto the concrete path behind her. He was fast and he was close. Alara risked a quick glance back over her shoulder. The superintendent was already rounding the corner of the building. He was moving with an athlete's focus, driven by more than simple annoyance. She realized the escape had ruined his whole careful system. Her hand instinctively tightened around the small, sharp edge of the SD card in her pocket. The card held the silent faces of the former tenants. They had not just cried for help, they had sent a warning. Alara suddenly veered to the right. She dove behind a towering green dumpster. The metal surface was sticky and smelled foul. The superintendent ran right past her hiding spot without slowing down. She heard him breathing heavily as he disappeared around the next corner. He was checking the main street. He assumed she would run toward the light and the noise of the city. But the videos had shown Alara that the trap was not the room. The trap was the exit. Alara slowly eased herself out from behind the dumpster. She pressed her back against the cool brick of the building. She had to move toward the center of the block, not the edge. She remembered a detail from the last victim's footage. The girl had tried to climb the outside fire escape that led to the roof. Alara quietly began to move along the back wall. She found the rusty, vertical ladder of the fire escape quickly in the dark. She began to climb with quiet, urgent movements. The metal rungs were cold and damp under her grip. She was halfway to the roof when she heard a new, terrifying sound. It was the superintendent's voice, now calm and amplified. "Alara, I know you are here. We just want to talk about the lease violation." The sound was coming from a speaker system. It was mounted on the exterior wall, hidden near the old service entrance. He had control over the entire property. The building itself was his accomplice. Alara reached the roof access door, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She twisted the metal handle. It was predictably locked tight. She sank down against the cold concrete of the roof, completely exposed. She looked across the skyline. The city lights seemed miles away, indifferent to the small, silent drama playing out below. She had broken out of the room, but she was still trapped within his walls. She finally pulled the SD card out of her pocket. She held the fragile piece of plastic and steel. She knew the answer, the real message, had to be in the data itself. Not just the faces. She needed a signal. She took a deep breath. The hunt was no longer about escaping the building. It was about defeating the intelligence that ran it. Alara knew the man would be coming up the interior stairs soon. She had maybe 2 minutes before he reached the roof. She needed to find something on the card that proved the pattern. She needed to show the world that this was not a one-off attack, but a long history. She pulled her laptop from her discarded backpack, which she had thrown through the window before jumping. It was scratched but functional. She slipped the SD card back into the slot. She scrolled through the dated folders again, focusing on the file properties. There were dozens of them. She opened a random video from 6 years prior. It showed a young man sitting exactly where Alara had sat. He was looking at the camera, mouthing the plea. Then, just before the video cut out, the sound momentarily flickered on. Alara heard a muffled, mechanical chime. It was a specific, distinct sound. It was the chime of an elevator arriving. She immediately opened 5 more video files. In every single one, just before the recording ended, there was the same brief, metallic ding. It was not the sound of the superintendent entering the room. It was the sound of the building's hidden, rarely used service elevator. Alara looked up, scanning the dark rooftop. She quickly spotted a small, boxy structure set far back from the main roof line. It was the housing for the service elevator machine room. It looked old and disused, covered in vines and rust. But the chime meant it was still functional, and it was used for one purpose. The superintendent used that elevator to quietly transport the tenants, or their belongings, from the room. That was why no one ever saw the victims leave the building. Alara realized the service elevator was his way in, and the true, hidden way out. She scrambled across the roof toward the small, boxy structure. She found a heavy steel maintenance door on the side of the housing. It was secured with a thick iron padlock. Alara frantically searched the ground around the housing. She found a rusted, loose crowbar lying half-buried in a pile of old insulation. She grabbed the bar, the cold metal heavy and rough in her hands. She heard the rhythmic, heavy thump of the stairwell door below the roof. He was on the final flight. She jammed the flat end of the crowbar into the loop of the padlock. She pulled back with all her strength, pushing her feet against the concrete. The lock was old, but the iron held firm. She tried again, shifting her grip higher on the bar for better leverage. She heard the unmistakable metallic screech of the interior stairwell door opening onto the roof. The superintendent was here. Alara gave one final, desperate heave. The corroded padlock snapped with a sharp, echoing crack. She tossed the crowbar aside and yanked the heavy steel door open. She saw the superintendent silhouetted at the roof entrance, staring directly at her. Alara dove into the small, dark room, slamming the heavy door shut behind her. She heard the superintendent immediately charging across the roof toward her hiding spot. She searched the tiny, dusty room in the pitch black. Her hand found a series of thick, tangled cables. She heard the sound of the steel door being violently hammered from the outside. She located a large, circular lever on the wall. It was labeled with a faded, almost invisible sign, "Emergency Stop." Alara pulled the lever down hard. A harsh, mechanical clank reverberated through the entire building. Then the heavy silence returned. She felt a small, almost imperceptible drop under her feet. She realized the whole machine room, and the cables it contained, was attached to the top of the elevator car. She was standing directly on top of the service elevator. The emergency stop had disconnected the car from its holding cables. It was now slowly dropping down the shaft. She heard the frantic, muffled shouts of the superintendent from the roof above. He knew exactly what she had done. He was trying to get the door open to stop her descent. Alara clung to a cable for balance as the car picked up speed. She was dropping through the silent heart of the building. She was not just escaping the room. She was escaping the entire structure. Alara felt the sickening rush of air as the elevator car plummeted downward. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the thin, flashing emergency lights that sped past the inspection ports. She could hear the heavy chains whipping wildly against the shaft walls. She held tightly to the cold, greasy cables, the metal biting into her hands. The descent was too fast now, beyond controlled safety. She knew the superintendent would be racing down the main stairwell, trying to cut her off at the ground floor. But she had the drop on him. She looked down into the blackness below her feet, desperately searching for any sign of a stop. The only way to survive this freefall was to somehow slow the car before impact. She reached out, feeling along the wall of the machine room for another control. Her fingers brushed against a heavy, rubber-coated brake cable. She grabbed it, planting her feet wide for leverage. She pulled on the cable with every ounce of strength she possessed. The car immediately began to shudder violently. A high-pitched, metallic shriek tore through the shaft. The sound of grinding metal was deafening. Sparks showered briefly from the braking mechanism above her. The rapid descent eased, then slowed to a bone-jarring, screeching crawl. Finally, with a loud, heavy thunk, the elevator car stopped. The sudden silence was shocking. Alara was pressed hard against the cables, breathless and shaking. She was somewhere deep below the main floors. She could smell damp earth and stale oil. She located the small, square trap door on the floor of the machine room. She managed to slide it open with a painful grunt. A thin, rectangular shaft of light shone up into the darkness. She carefully climbed through the opening and dropped onto the ceiling of the elevator car below. She found herself directly above the inner cage. She could see the thick metal doors of the elevator car. They were marked with faded numbers indicating the sub-basement level. She heard pounding from the other side of the shaft wall. It was the superintendent, still running down the main fire escape stairs. He was close to catching her. Alara reached down and forced the heavy inner doors apart with sheer adrenaline. She squeezed out of the small gap. She tumbled onto the cold, concrete floor of a cramped service tunnel. The space was dimly lit by a single caged bulb. The tunnel led toward a heavy, steel security door. Alara ran toward the door, ignoring the burning pain in her side. She slammed her shoulder against the release bar. The door groaned open with a rusty complaint. She found herself in a large, subterranean parking garage. This was the true final exit. She sprinted across the oil-stained concrete toward the main exit ramp. A blinding pair of headlights suddenly flared to life at the far end of the garage. A dark sedan accelerated toward her, tires squealing. It was the superintendent, driving a car that had been waiting there all along. He was not just a building manager. He was the whole infrastructure of the trap. Alara did not slow down. She threw her body over the low, concrete barrier of the exit ramp. She rolled once, then stood up and began scrambling up the steep incline toward the city street. She could hear the engine roaring behind her, closing the distance rapidly. She knew she had the SD card. She had the proof. Now she needed to reach the light. Alara felt the sharp, abrasive texture of the concrete tearing at her skin as she scrambled up the ramp. The car's engine noise was deafening, the sound echoing savagely off the garage walls. She heard the driver slam on the brakes, tires shrieking again as the sedan swerved to block the ramp. He had misjudged her speed. The brief, violent delay gave her the fraction of a second she needed. She saw a small metal utility door set into the side wall near the top of the ramp. She lunged for the handle, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The door was unlocked. She yanked it open and threw herself through the narrow gap. She landed hard on a short flight of concrete stairs. The utility door slammed shut behind her, plunging her into a thick, absolute darkness. She was in a stairwell, smelling faintly of bleach and stale cigarette smoke. She could hear the car horn blaring repeatedly from the garage below. He was stuck, but he would be out of the car and after her instantly. She felt along the wall, finding the cold metal handrail. She took the steps two at a time, moving upward. She burst through the heavy steel door at the top. She tumbled out onto a brightly lit, busy sidewalk. The sudden transition from darkness to the overwhelming, chaotic sensory input of the city street was disorienting. Car horns, shouting, the smell of street food, and the dazzling neon signs all assaulted her senses. She was surrounded by people. She was safe. Alara stopped running, leaning heavily against a street lamp, gasping for air. She quickly scanned the crowd for the gray overalls and the angry, familiar face. She saw only indifferent, rushing strangers. He would not follow her into this much light and noise. He was confined to the shadows, the tunnels, the hidden places. She pressed her hand against her throbbing side. She felt the small, hard rectangle of the SD card still secure in her pocket. The card held the silent, repeated pleas of every person who had occupied that room before her. It was not just evidence of a crime. It was the testimony of a silent community. Alara pulled out her phone. The cracked screen lit up, showing a network signal and the current time. She had to call the police, But she knew the moment she mentioned a hidden camera, an old superintendent, and a Secret Service elevator, they would dismiss her. She needed to lead with the evidence. She thought about the videos, the pattern, the terrifying realization. The camera was not for watching her. It was for capturing a specific moment of panic from everyone. She needed to connect the faces. Alara opened her browser and navigated to the city's public records archive. She typed in the address of the apartment building. She cross-referenced the names of the past tenants that were subtly listed in the video file metadata on the SD card. The system was slow and frustrating. She focused on the name of the girl who had mouthed the word help 5 years ago. The search returned a single result. It was not a missing person report. It was a small, archived news article from an obscure local paper. The headline read, "Asterisk, woman who vanished from city apartment found alive after 5 years." Asterisk. Alara's breath hitched. She read the article frantically, scanning the dense text. The woman was found miles away, suffering from severe memory loss and disorientation. She claimed to have woken up in a strange city with no idea how she got there. She had no recollection of her previous life or her disappearance. The police closed the case as a voluntary departure due to mental distress. Alara scrolled through the rest of the names on the SD card. Every single person who had recorded a desperate message for help had resurfaced months or years later, in various distant locations. They were all found alive, but every single one of them was suffering from the same profound, irreversible memory loss. The superintendent was not a killer. He was a curator. The camera was not recording their death. It was recording the moment their identity was erased. The truth was worse than Alara's fear. The man was stealing their lives, one by one. He was clearing out the old tenants' memories to make room for a new, empty shell. Alara looked down at her shaking hands, then at the bright city lights. She still had her memories, her life, herself. She had broken his cycle. She held the proof of his 10-year operation. She took a photo of the SD card in her palm with her phone, then instantly uploaded the key video file to a secure public cloud drive. She sent a simple, anonymous link to the city's largest investigative reporter. The trap was sprung. Now the real fight began. Alara knew that digital proof, however compelling, needed a physical anchor. The apartment building was not just a rental property. It was a factory for erasure. She needed to ensure the police investigated the building itself before the superintendent could clean up his operation. She sent a second short message, this time to the police tip line. It contained the building address and a single cryptic phrase. Asterisk, check the service elevator sub-basement. Locate the staging area. Asterisk. She knew she had done all she could from a distance. She needed to find a safe place to wait for the story to break. She hailed a passing taxi, throwing herself into the back seat. "Where to?" the driver asked, looking at her wide eyes and torn clothing with concern. "A place with lots of people," Alara said, her voice still rough from running. "The Central Public Library. And please drive fast." The cab pulled away from the curb, merging into the stream of city traffic. Alara stared out the window, watching the familiar streets rush past. The sense of immediate, physical danger had subsided, replaced by a cold, calculating resolve. She looked at her reflection in the dark glass of the taxi window. She saw the cuts and bruises, the frantic energy still pulsing just beneath the surface. She realized the superintendent would know the evidence was out there. He was a systematic, patient operator. He would be watching the public response, tracking the digital fallout. She quickly disabled all location services on her phone and removed the SIM card. She needed to go completely dark. As the taxi approached the brightly lit facade of the enormous, historic library, Alara felt a small, almost imperceptible tremor of hope. The library was a place of knowledge and record, the opposite of his house of forgotten identities. She paid the driver and stepped onto the brightly lit sidewalk. She looked back down the street, expecting to see a dark sedan, but saw nothing suspicious. She pushed open the heavy glass doors and disappeared into the comforting anonymity of the crowded main hall. She found a quiet, secluded table in the basement archives, surrounded by stacks of ancient, heavy books. She set her laptop down and waited. Minutes turned into an agonizing hour. She repeatedly refreshed the homepage of the city's largest news outlet. Finally, a flashing headline appeared, replacing the usual mundane evening news. It read, "Urgent investigation. Cryptic evidence suggests dark pattern in city apartment building." Alara felt a sudden, profound wave of relief wash over her. She clicked the link. The article detailed the anonymous tip, the shared video evidence of the victims, and the rapid deployment of police to the specific address. The journalist had followed the thread. The police were reportedly securing the property, searching the main building, and most crucially, mobilizing a specialized team to access the rarely used sub-basement service area. The fight was now being fought by the forces of the city, not just one terrified woman. But as she read the final paragraph, a new, unsettling detail caused her breath to catch. The article included a brief, updated statement from the local precinct captain. It noted that while the main building was secured, the prime suspect, identified as the building's maintenance supervisor, had not been apprehended. He was listed as at large. Alara closed the laptop lid quickly. The superintendent was still out there. He was resourceful, patient, and now he was cornered and exposed. He knew exactly who had stopped him. The fear returned, sharper this time, because it was personal. Alara looked around the quiet archive. She was surrounded by knowledge, but utterly alone. She had taken down his system, but she had not neutralized him. She slid the laptop into her bag and stood up slowly. She had to keep moving. She had to keep moving. Alara walked quickly, blending into the ebb and flow of people leaving the library. She needed cash, a change of clothes, and a way to completely disappear for a few days until the investigation was complete. She found a 24-hour convenience store a few blocks away. The fluorescent lights hummed loudly, creating a harsh, artificial glare. She bought a cheap hoodie, a generic baseball cap, and a new prepaid phone with an untraceable number. She paid in cash from the small emergency fund she always kept hidden. As she waited for the cashier to ring up her purchases, she saw a familiar reflection in the glass of the refrigerated drinks case. It was the superintendent. He was standing across the street, partially obscured by the shadow of an awning. He was no longer wearing the gray overalls. He wore a dark, unremarkable jacket and trousers. But the stillness of his posture, the patient, unblinking focus of his gaze, was unmistakable. He was not running. He was watching the only place she was likely to go for basic necessities. He had tracked her movements, anticipating her need for anonymity. He was waiting for her to panic. Alara forced herself to breathe slowly. She completed the transaction, her hands steady as she accepted the small bag of items. She walked out of the store without acknowledging him, turning her back on the street. She headed down a side alley, away from the main thoroughfare. She moved with a deliberate, unhurried pace, masking the sheer terror that was churning in her stomach. Once she was completely out of his line of sight, she broke into a run, tearing off the side street like a hunted animal. She threw on the hoodie and pulled the cap low over her eyes. She needed to find a place he would never expect, a place that was constantly monitored but constantly moving. She thought of the central transit station. A hive of constant, recorded activity. She hailed another cab, giving the driver the name of the main train terminal. As the cab sped away, Alara turned on the new prepaid phone. She had one more task before she could fully vanish. She pulled up the cloud link for the key video file she had shared with the reporter. She then opened the new phone's messaging app. She composed a short, final message to the investigative reporter whose name she had seen on the news site. She did not identify herself. She simply wrote, *, check the camera's power source. The data logs will reveal the financial backer. This runs deeper than one man. *. She knew the SD card data, specifically the logs of when the camera was activated and deactivated over the years, would show a pattern of maintenance and payment linked to a larger, shadowy entity. The superintendent was just the groundskeeper. There was a silent architect behind the whole operation. Alara sent the message, then immediately broke the phone in two and threw the pieces out the window. She leaned back in the seat, feeling the rhythmic sway of the cab. She was now cut off, alone, and moving toward a massive transport hub. She had eliminated all traceable connections to her identity. She was now a ghost in the machine. The only thing she had left was the memory of those silent, pleading faces. That memory fueled her determination to stay alive and ensure the full truth emerged. She arrived at the train station, a vast, echoing dome of metal and glass. The station was alive with the sound of rolling luggage and shouted goodbyes. She bought a one-way ticket to the farthest city on the board, a destination she knew nothing about. She walked toward the platform, melting into the stream of departing travelers. Alara found her designated track, the air thick with the metallic scent of braking trains. She stepped onto the platform, feeling the deep, resonant thrum of the immense locomotives. She was surrounded by hundreds of people, all focused on their own journeys. This anonymity was her only true shield now. She located her car and boarded the train, slipping into an empty window seat. The overhead lights cast a soft, yellow glow on the plush, blue fabric. She pulled the baseball cap lower, keeping her gaze focused on the window. She watched the platform fill up, scrutinizing every face, every hurried movement. Her adrenaline was still high, making every approaching shadow feel like a threat. She saw a reflection in the window glass. It was not the superintendent, but a middle-aged woman with a child. Alara forced herself to relax her shoulders, letting out a long, silent breath. The train doors hissed shut. The final call for departure echoed through the station. The train gave a deep, preparatory shudder, then began to move slowly. The world outside the window started to glide past, accelerating steadily. Alara watched the station lights recede. She allowed herself a small, fleeting moment of triumph. She had escaped the physical trap, exposed the operation, and now she was putting hundreds of miles between herself and the architect of her terror. But as the train picked up speed and the urban landscape dissolved into the darkness of the countryside, she saw something move in the aisle reflection. A man was walking slowly down the car, checking the seat numbers. He was tall and wore a professional, dark trench coat. He was not the superintendent, but he carried the same air of detached, predatory calm. He reached her row and stopped, looking directly at her. "Is this seat taken?" he asked, his voice low, educated, and utterly devoid of warmth. Alara's blood ran cold. The seat beside her was empty, but she felt a profound, chilling certainty that this was not a random traveler. This was the answer to her final anonymous tip. This was the financial backer, the silent architect, the man who knew the pattern of the camera logs. He did not need the supervisor anymore. He was here to clean up the last inconvenient piece of evidence, Alara herself. She smiled faintly, a gesture that did not reach his cold eyes. He pulled a small, silver travel case off the rack and lowered himself into the seat next to her. He smelled faintly of expensive leather and something sterile, like a chemical solvent. He was too close. "You should have stayed in the dark, Alara," he murmured, leaning slightly toward her. "It was safer there." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat, slowly pulling out something small and white. It was a syringe. Alara stared at the needle, paralyzed by the sudden, inevitable confrontation. She thought of the terrified, erased faces on the SD card, still hidden in her pocket. She had broken their silence, but she was about to join them. "I am sorry about the mess," the man continued, his voice calm. "But the process is much cleaner this way. You will wake up somewhere far away, with a fresh start." Alara felt the sharp, desperate clarity of final choice. She knew she could not fight him physically. She had to create chaos. With a sudden, explosive movement, Alara drove her elbow sharply into the man's ribs. He gasped, momentarily stunned. She seized the small, silver travel case he had set down. She threw the case with all her strength toward the emergency stop lever at the end of the train car. The case struck the lever with a loud, ringing clang. The train instantly shrieked, the emergency brakes locking up violently. The entire car was thrown forward. Passengers cried out, luggage tumbled from the racks, and the man beside her was slammed hard against the window. Alara didn't wait. She threw open the emergency exit door. The train was decelerating rapidly, but was still moving at high speed, tearing through the dark countryside. She plunged out into the screaming wind. Alara hit the gravel embankment beside the track with a sickening jolt. The force of the impact knocked the air from her lungs. She tumbled and rolled down the steep slope, a blur of motion and pain. The sharp stones and coarse dirt scraped fiercely against her body. She finally stopped rolling near the bottom, coming to rest in a tangled thicket of cold, wet weeds. The noise was immense. The grinding screech of the train's locked wheels was deafening as it fought to stop. The train car sped past her position, a colossal, dark shadow slicing through the night. She lay still for a moment, waiting for the world to stop spinning, focusing only on the sharp, metallic tang of blood in her mouth. A second later, she heard the sound of the emergency door being wrenched open on the decelerating train. The man in the trench coat was coming for her. Alara forced herself to crawl, dragging her bruised body through the undergrowth. She looked back up the embankment. She saw a dark, slender figure descending swiftly, illuminated faintly by the receding train lights. He was agile, focused, and utterly silent in his movements. She pushed herself to her feet, finding an agonizing but functional balance. She turned away from the tracks and plunged deeper into the dark, unknown woods bordering the railway line. The trees were dense, their branches weaving together overhead to block the moonlight. She ran, tripping over roots, the branches whipping at her face. She focused only on the sounds behind her, the crunch of boots on the gravel, then the snapping of dry twigs as he entered the woods after her. She had to find a road, a house, any sign of life. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs felt like lead weights. Suddenly, the dense thicket gave way. She stumbled into a small, unexpected clearing. In the center stood a derelict, isolated farm building, an old, collapsed wooden barn. It was a place of decay and deep shadows. Alara didn't hesitate. She found a gap in the splintered siding and slipped inside. The air within the barn was heavy with the smell of mold and dust. She crouched behind a pile of ancient hay bales. She forced her ragged breathing to slow. She could hear him moving through the woods, close now. His steps were measured, confident. He was not chasing, he was tracking. He knew she was trapped here. The man paused at the edge of the clearing. "It is over, Alara," his voice echoed, calm and carrying in the night air. "You cannot outrun what you do not understand." He stepped into the clearing, his silhouette stark against the faint moonlight. He walked slowly toward the ruined barn door. Alara felt the small, hard presence of the SD card in her pocket. The card held the evidence of his victims, and now, it was her only weapon. She had to risk one last, desperate maneuver. As the man crossed the threshold of the barn, his eyes adjusting to the darkness, Alara did not wait. She launched herself from behind the hay bales, not at him, but at an old, suspended metal pulley system high above. She grabbed a thick, dusty rope, swinging her weight and kicking out hard. Her foot connected with a hanging wooden plank, dislodging a cascade of debris. A huge, heavy piece of rotten timber crashed down directly onto the man's path. He cried out, stumbling backward violently as the timber struck his shoulder. He did not fall, but the surprise bought Alara a precious few seconds. She scrambled toward the barn's far wall, where a small, high window was barely visible. She reached the wall and began to climb the rough interior frame, desperately trying to reach the broken glass opening. The man recovered instantly, his breath harsh. "Clever," he snarled, his voice losing its detached calm for the first time. "But predictable." He rushed toward her position. Alara squeezed through the narrow, jagged opening just as his hand grabbed at her ankle. The glass tore her skin, but she ignored the pain. She dropped onto the soft, loamy earth outside the barn. She was free of the enclosure, but she was still deep in the isolated countryside. She started running again, aiming toward a faint, flickering light in the distant hills. It was not a street lamp, it was a farmhouse. Her only chance. She started running again, aiming toward a faint, flickering light in the distant hills. It was not a street lamp, it was a farmhouse. Her only chance. Alara pushed her body past the point of exhaustion, plunging through fields slick with dew. The ground was uneven, but the sheer desperation of her flight lent her a temporary, frantic speed. The man was right behind her, his movements silent now, a dark shape closing the distance effortlessly. He was patient. He knew she could not sustain this pace. She burst through a line of low shrubs and found herself on a narrow dirt road. The farmhouse light seemed marginally closer, its yellow glow a beacon of civilization. She heard the snap of a branch right behind her, too close for comfort. She knew he was preparing to end the chase. In a final, exhausted surge, Alara veered off the road and threw herself over a low, dry stone wall. As she landed, her hand instinctively found a sharp, softball-sized rock hidden among the weeds. She rolled and came up on one knee, turning to face her pursuer. The man stepped over the wall, emerging into the faint light from the distant farm. He looked immaculate, despite the crash, his expression a mask of cold disappointment. "This is truly unnecessary, Alara," he said, taking a slow, measured step toward her. "You have forced an irreversible escalation." Alara held the rock steady, her breathing ragged, but her focus absolute. She wasn't going to wait for him to close the gap.